Thanks again for being here today. Let me invite you to pick out your message guide if you would. And you're going to notice that there's a little discrepancy this morning between what's in the order of service and the insert that's actually in your program. As I had said earlier, these have been pretty interesting days, particularly this week. And there's a lot going on. And I was in New Jersey, left on Thursday afternoon to take care of some family business. I was going to visit my mom, take care of that, and then visit with the lady that we prayed for, or actually prayed for this morning, Bob String, who's the wife of the pastor that I served with for a number of years. I wanted to go and visit with them as she's on hospice. I had a meeting planned with another pastor to discuss a leadership issue, and it was just like boom, 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 all kinds of stuff. And then, if you would, the coronavirus kind of blossomed, if you would, and it kind of upset the entire apple cart. I didn't get to see my family. I didn't get to see the lady that I had gone down to see. I spent a night in a hotel. Because there were just other circumstances going on, it was very interesting. But I tend to, when I go to visit somebody in the hospital or I go to visit somebody, I try to go in prepared, kind of thing. I try to just spend a few moments in the car after I park to just look to the Lord and say, what is it that you want to share, or is there something that would be needful for these people to hear. And so I kind of planned on kind of focusing on these particular thoughts when I visited this lady and her husband. But with all that's going on and just the enormity of these days, you don't get to speak to these issues very often. If I was to speak to coronavirus next weekend, it would kind of seem as an afterthought, wouldn't it? But I wanted to forego what we were planning on looking at this morning, and last night tried to rework some thoughts to share with you today with regard to what's going on around us. And so I've kind of, you're going to have to pardon me, this is not going to have, if you would, the normal level of, I can't even say that. This is just going to come out a little bit rougher than things might normally come out on a Sunday morning. But I trust that it will minister to your heart, it will encourage you for the things which are ahead in these days. So we're going to be looking at just some thoughts around the theme of deliverance. Around the theme of deliverance. And we're going to, again, we'll circle back to some of the last messages with regard to for better or for best in the coming days. Let me encourage you, you can follow along, because this morning the text is in Psalm 124, and so you can follow along there in your Bibles. If you use the Bible in the pew, it's page 550, and you can look along there. But Psalm 124 is one of what are called the Pilgrim Psalms. These are Psalms 120 through 134 that were normally used as the people of God would take pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They were used and they were rehearsed during that time as people traveled. Sometimes they were called traveling psalms. Each of these really kind of has a different theme, and they were used to remind people of God's work amongst them through the years. And so the theme of Psalm 124 is the theme of deliverance. As the people of Israel journeyed to Jerusalem, or wherever it may be that they were going, they would sing of how God had helped them in ages past. And so what I want to do today is kind of draw some truths out of this psalm of deliverance as we travel through these days, because we are looking for God to deliver us, if you would, in the midst of the things that are going on. For God to provide for us in the midst of the challenges that are around us. For God to calm our hearts in the midst of the anxiety that we are finding ourselves in. So today's transforming truth, and again, if the insert's a little wonky, just bear with it. Just write it on the side, scribble it up the spine of it, whatever. We'll make it through. But today's transforming truth is this: remembering the faithfulness of God in the past reassures us of his faithfulness in the present. For those Israelites and for those who would reflect on these Psalms during these times, it was a reminder for them that God had been faithful to them in the past. That God had met them in the midst of challenge, in the midst of anxiety, in the midst of catastrophe. And that would reassure them that God would continue to be faithful to them in the things that they would face in the present and the things to come. We reflect on and we look back again, Lamentations chapter 3, on the great faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Great is the faithfulness of God. His mercies are new every morning. And so God's people would reflect on these thoughts, and they would draw encouragement, and they would be sustained by these things because they were being reminded of God's goodness. You're going to notice that the stage looks a little different this morning. It's kind of nice. I can roam a little bit more. It's interesting. One person said, "Isn't it interesting? Gosh, I never realized how small that place you had to walk around was." But now I get to walk around a little bit more. But you're going to notice that the communion table's up here. We're trying to we're going to experiment. We're going to move some stuff around. We're going to see how it looks, what works good. But one of the things, and right now there's a beautiful scarf on the table and stuff like that, but along the front of the table, it reminds us that we do this in remembrance of him. That one of the things that Christ encouraged us to do was to reflect regularly on the amazing work that he did on the cross, having come, living a perfect life, dying on the cross, going to the grave, and then resurrecting again, to be reminded of what God has done for our encouragement, because these are tough days. These are tough days. And so we have this psalm here that is meant to allow them to celebrate the faithfulness of God and to be reminded, reassured of what that means for their present. If you take all of these Psalms, 120 to 134 together, they kind of are a catalog if you read through them. It'd be an encouraging read, an interesting read if you would like to. But they really are kind of a catalog of life, because they deal with issues that God's people have been struggling with for thousands of years. Issues like hope, joy, perseverance, humility. We're invited in these Psalms to think what might have happened if God didn't show up, if God didn't step in to a particular situation or a particular happening. Now, we don't know exactly the event in Israel's history that David is referring to here when he wrote this psalm. There are many times we know as we rehearse the history of Israel where they really needed God to show up. And I think if we were to be honest and think about our lives and reflect back on things, we would realize, boy, I'm really glad that God showed up there. And I'm sure glad that God showed up over here. And man, I know next week is going to be a real tough one. I just hope that God will show up there. We don't know. But there are many times where God rescues his people from calamity, from destruction, from the onslaught of foreign kings, from all manner of different happenings. Some of those things, I mean, think about, here are God's people and they are in captivity in Egypt. Now, the movie Charlton Heston, 10 Commandments, not exactly to the letter. But you know what? It's interesting cinema. And I have to admit, I really love the movie. I mean, it used to be that was showed along with Jesus of Nazareth every year around Christmas time or whatever. And we'd sit down and we would watch it. Couldn't wait for the sea to part. And you were like, whoa, look how God showed up. But his people are in captivity. It seems that they're lost, but God shows up in an amazing way. He sends the great wind, he divides the sea, the people walk through. When the people get through, the wind disappears, the water closes in, Pharaoh and his guys are wiped out. Score. And God's people are saved. It's an interesting thing when you read through the scripture that this isn't an isolated incident. And God's people knew that this was not an isolated incident. We see God show up so many times. Abraham and his wife Sarah. Abraham is to be a blessing to the world. He's going to have children as sands of the sea and the stars of the sky, he and Sarai, his wife, cannot have children. And they're well along in years, and what happens? God shows up. God shows up. And Sarah gives birth to a son, Isaac. God's prophet Daniel, his servant Daniel, in Babylon. He refuses to stop praying. He refuses to pray to Nebuchadnezzar, and those that are seeking his ill recognize this. He does what he had always did before, or had done before. He opens the windows and he prays, and they see him, and they bring him there, and they say, you know what, you've got to get rid of Daniel because he's praying to another God. He's not praying to you, Nebuchadnezzar. It breaks Nebuchadnezzar's heart because he loves Daniel. He puts Daniel in the lion's den, and what does God do? God shows up in an amazing way. He shuts the lions' mouths, and Daniel is spared. In the book of Acts, we see Peter. He's put in jail. And he's spending time in jail. He's bound with chains in there, and he's guarded by the soldiers. You know, his life is in question. And what happens? He doesn't just escape. There's the earthquake. And God, the door's open. And Daniel and Peter, he just simply walks out. He walks out. So God shows up regularly in the blackest and the bleakest of moments. And let me reassure you this morning, as black and as bleak as it may sound, things are outside. God shows up. God shows up. When you first read this psalm, you know, you get the sense of desperation. There is a sense of desperation, a sense of barely having escaped a danger and now finding yourself in a safe place. There's this gasp, if you would, with regard to this situation. And there's this phrase that's used at the very beginning of it to set the stage in Psalm 124 and in verse 1. It just simply says, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side. Well, this isn't necessarily the thought of the morning. Let me just kind of jump off and say this. Regardless of what anyone else does, or anyone else says, regardless of what happens, we always come back to, if the Lord had not been on our side. That our tomorrows and our purpose and all that surrounds our life is in his hands. It's not necessarily in the hands of anyone who might be managing any situation. If it had not been for the Lord. Now there are three metaphors or pictures that are used here in this particular passage. And they're pretty obvious, but I just want to point them out to you. The first is this, is that he points out that there was some peril from beasts. Now in the Middle East, it's very common, wild animals were very common, they were a common danger. In fact, in Babylon, King Darius, he figured that Daniel would have been torn apart by the wild beasts down in the lion's den. But God had other plans. And it could have been that maybe Daniel even said, if it had not been for the Lord, the lions would have torn me apart. But there's this picture of the beasts used here. There's also a picture, if you would, of flood. Now, we don't often think about this, but flash floods were pretty common in Israel. Rainstorms would fill the cracks, and the ground was often dry, and there was no place, if you would, for the water to go. It would form gullies, and those would come together, and ultimately the waters would cause unexpected catastrophe in towns in the city. People would be swept away as the waters grew. But the Lord, if it had not been for him, he provides a solid foundation for us so that we're not engulfed in trouble. We may have times when we're tossed about. We may have times when, if you will, we're submerged and we gurgle a little bit in life. But he sustains us. He uses the peril of flood And then he uses the parallel of the snare. Often those who would hunt in that day would set traps, the fowler's snare, in order to catch wildfowl or bird for dinner. And the bird is trapped and there seems to be no way out, but the snare breaks and the bird goes free. Can I say for us, when it seems that we're snared and all of a sudden that's not just simply good fortune. That's God at work. That's divine intervention on our behalf. When we feel caged in, what does God do? He shows up and provides deliverance. So David here in this psalm, he says, if it hadn't been for the Lord's involvement, if God had not showed up, we would have been utterly destroyed. We would have been consumed by the beast. We would have been overrun by the flood. We would have been caught and carried away in the snare. So a couple thoughts this morning with regard to his provision and his deliverance. And the first is that I think in Psalm 124 we see the attention of the Lord. One of the things, and I'm going to say that's implied here, although he does not say it expressly, is that God really does pay attention to our lives. That he is aware of what we experience and what we go through. The attention of the Lord. In verses 1 and 2, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side, let Israel say now, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side. If it had not been for what he had done, his eye was on us. If God hadn't shown up at just the right time, we would have been finished. But God's eye, the scripture says, is on the sparrow. Right? And the song says, and I know he watches me. God's attention is always on you. God is large enough and big enough and strong enough, mighty enough. He is whatever enough to be mindful of the things that each of us go through individually in our daily lives moment by moment. And not only us as individuals, but us collectively. The attention of the Lord, he eyed their despair. And we see that he does this throughout Scripture. He's constantly, again, God has eye on us. Psalm 102 says this, for he looked down from the height of his sanctuary. From heaven the Lord viewed the earth to hear the groaning of the prisoner, to release those appointed to death. What's he saying here? He's saying, he's got his eye on those who are in prison, those who are ensnared, those who are, if you would, and he's able to work. He hears. It says they're groaning and releases those appointed to death. He's got an eye on our groaning, our despair. He embraces our dilemma. Over in Hebrews chapter 2, it speaks to this, that he's aware of the situations that we're in. Hebrews 2 in verse 17, it says this, therefore in all things he had to be made like his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. God didn't just, if you would stay in heaven and say, boy, that's really tough for them. Man, she's really going through a rough one this week. He's really, that's a big burden. But the scripture says that Jesus, that God, the Son of God, entered into our situation. It makes it clear that in the midst of our situation, he never sinned, but he experienced all of the challenge and all that we do. He embraced our dilemma and went to be a propitiation, a payment for our sins, for our brokenness. The attention of the Lord is on you. It's on me. He eyes our despair. He embraces our dilemma. And what does he do? He empties himself for our deliverance. He doesn't only see it, but he enters into it, and then he engages to deal with it. 2 Corinthians 8, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for our sakes he became poor, that through his poverty might become rich. That you through his poverty might become rich. Philippians 2 talks about that in great detail, beginning at verse 5 and going down. That he took upon himself the role, the form of a servant. He didn't consider equality with God something that he needed to hold on to, but rather he then became like us and became obedient to death, even the death of the cross. Empty for our obedience. God, his attention, there's nothing you go through that God is not aware of it. The converse of that is there's nothing that you go through that God is not aware of. Whether it is good or bad, God is always aware of the things we go through because we always have God's attention. Always. So God's attention is not lost in the midst of what's going on today. He's aware of that. The second, let me suggest this, that he's aware of our problems. We have his attention and he is aware. If not for the Lord, it implies that attention that he gives us, and there is an awareness of them. We would have been, look at verse 3. It says, if it had not been for the Lord, verse 1 and 2, if you would, shorten, when men rose up against us, then they would have swallowed us alive, when their wrath was kindled against us. God's aware when things aren't going well. If you would, and here as David writes, when we're doomed, God's aware. He's aware. His attention is on us when we're doomed. When Egypt comes against us, God's aware. When Babylon raises up, God's aware. Assyria shows itself, God is aware. When there's something hindering the progression of God's will, with regard to, or us from accomplishing what it is, God's aware. He's aware. When we're doomed, he is aware. When we are about to be devoured, he's aware. It's interesting, as the verse says, it talks about they would have swallowed us alive. They would have consumed us. We were going to get eaten alive. God was aware. We were being sought out by the enemy to be devoured, and we were doomed. Eaten alive means alive. In Job chapter 1, someone who went through a fair bit of challenge, this is what it says in Job chapter 1, verse 7. The Lord said to Satan, where are you coming from? Where do you come? From where do you come? So Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth in it. One of the things we need to be aware of is Satan's prowling around. He's got his eye on things too. He's not omniscient. He's not omnipresent. He's certainly not omnipotent. But he knows stuff. And he goes around and he's checking things out. If you would, as much, well, I can't say as much, but just like, I can't say just like, Satan has attention on you and me too. And by his observation, he is aware of where we're at, and he brings it to us. He seeks us out, and he wants to swallow us. Scripture tells us that our adversary, Satan, that he's hungry. It's kind of an interesting thought, isn't it? He's hungry. Over in 1 Peter chapter 5, in verse 8, it says this. It says, be sober and be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks around like a roaring lion, Daniel in the lion's den, the roaring lion, the hungry lions, seeking whom he may swallow up, who he may devour, who he can eat alive. We're doomed. We're set to be devoured. In some ways, some of us are defeated. We're defeated. David writes on here, he says, then the waters would have overwhelmed us. We wouldn't have been able to keep our head above water. The stream would have gone over our souls. If God had not been with us, then we would have drowned. We would have drowned in the midst of this. We would have been defeated, doomed, devoured, defeated. And what? Disappointed. Look at verse 5. The idea here is again, it's similar to verse 4, but it's a different tact. And the idea is then those swollen waters would have gone over our soul. Ecclesiastes says, then I looked on all the works of my hands that I had done, and the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all of it was vanity. It was just disappointing. It was grasping at wind. There wasn't any profit under the sun. God's attention is on us, and He's aware of the situation that we're doomed, we're set to be devoured. We're defeated, we're on the edge of losing it. And that much of our life, it's just disappointing. We try so hard after certain things. So let's just close it here. What's the answer? What's the answer for our provision? If we have His attention and He is aware, what is the answer? If the Lord had not been there, David says, we would have been, this would have been our heart, this would have been our situation. This is where we would have ended up. But we didn't end up there. So since God is there, and since we can trust Him, and since He is for us, the answer is this. First, that we can find pardon instead of doom. With regard to spiritual things, we can find pardon instead of doom. He says in verse 6, he says, blessed be the Lord, who has not given us as prey to their teeth. Over in Micah, it says, who is a God like you? Who is a God like you? Who pardons sin and forgives transgression of the remnant of His inheritance. You don't stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy. For whatever our situation is, in the midst of the doom, God gives us pardon. If you're here this morning, my question is, do you know that pardon? What's a pardon? In simple terms, it's just the expunging, it's the removal of the charge against you. It is taking that charge and taking it away from you. And in our case, the charge that was made against us of sin was taken off of us and placed on Christ. And as we said before, God looks at us the way He sees His Son, and God looks at His Son the way He would have seen us. He's guilty of everything, even though He did nothing, and we're guilty of nothing, even though we did everything. He pardons us in the midst of doom. He protects us instead of allowing us to be devoured. Verse 7, he says, our soul escaped as a bird from the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken, we have escaped. That idea of being escaped, it's actually the word delivered. God delivered the fowl, the bird. So God not only pardons us rather than having us in doom, but He also protects us so that we are not devoured. The psalmist also, over in Psalm 91 in verse 4, this is what he says. He says, He will cover you with His feathers. Under His wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. Pardon, protection. We can prevail instead of being defeated because God is with us. The snare is broken. The psalmist again in Psalm 44, this is what he says. Through you we push back our enemies. Through your name we trample our foes. The Lord is always there. We're not to be defeated. We are able to prevail. As he speaks to Peter in Matthew, he says, you know, the gates of hell will not prevail against us. As we look to Him and as we live in Him, the gates of hell do not prevail. We're not defeated. Instead of being disappointed, we're pleased. In verse 8, Our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. He's there to help us. We don't have to worry about being disappointed. Why? Because he is there. If it hadn't been for the Lord, he's there with us. My soul is satisfied, Psalm 63, with the richest of foods that God provides. Singing lips in my mouth will praise you for what you have done. He satisfies the thirsty and the hungry with good things. We have God's attention. He is aware. And he provides the answer and provides for us. We're not doomed. We're not defeated. We're not discouraged. But he's there with us. We're assured of his presence all along the way. It's a reminder to us. It was a reminder to God's people. It's a reminder to us. Psalm ends with that unique affirmation, if you would, or that unique verse at the end, that our help is in the name of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Historically, it's pretty interesting. French Protestants would sing that at their service every week. They would use it to begin their service. When things were tough, when things were hard, each and every week, each and every time they were together, they affirmed, they remembered that their help was in the Lord, who had made the heavens and earth. Let me just close with this thought. For all that we're going to hear, for all that we've already heard, for all that's going to happen, we can say, if it had not been for the Lord, where would we be? Where would we be? But perhaps the closing question this morning comes from that 8th verse. Because our help and our deliverance, all of those things are partly come from the one who is the maker of heaven and earth. This morning, who are you trusting to provide for you? Because it's very easy for us to put our trust in any number of things other than the one that Scripture says is the maker of heaven and earth. When you leave here today, do not fear, because the one who is the maker of heaven and earth has this. As you go about your week, don't be anxious, because the one who is the maker of heaven and earth has got this. When those around you, perhaps they start maybe not feeling well, don't worry. The one who is the maker of heaven and earth has this. When it seems like the stuff we read on the news is just, or hear on the news, or we read in the paper, or shows up on our screen, when it just seems like it's just doom, don't worry. The one who is the maker of heaven and earth is our help, and he's got this. He's got it. He's got it for you and what you will have to manage and go through, and he has it for me and the things that I've got to walk through. So today, let's just reflect on the idea, if it wasn't for the Lord, where would we be if it was not for him? And we can walk through what is before us with confidence, knowing that the one who is the maker of heaven and earth is our help. That he is the one who provides our pardon. He is the one who meets us in the midst of all of these things. He's our great provider. And so we look to him. Father, we thank you for this morning. And Lord, we